and welcome to Rise. I have such a special woman here with us today. Her name is Wendy Meltz, and she's an internationally recognized sex and relationship expert and the author of the highly acclaimed sexual abuse recovery classic, The Sexual Healing Journey, a guide for survivors of sexual abuse. I have a very old version of this book here because I have it for many years. And this is now available in Spanish. Her educational website, healthysex.com, provides articles, interviews, and free videos on relearning touch techniques and sexual healing. Thank you so much, Wendy, for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I know that you are retired now, you don't run in the same pace, but nevertheless, you have made an impact on the world, and I want to acknowledge you for that. And I can't wait to dive into your wisdom and share it with our audience because this subject, this topic is such an important one.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to start by asking you your personal story. How did you came up with pioneering this book, right? Because you wrote it when there was not so much discussion
Right.
and conversations about sexual healing.
Exactly. Well, I'm grabbing here this first book I did way back in the 1980s. I did this book. I co-authored a book, Incest and Sexuality, a guide to understanding and healing. And this was for professionals and the lay public. But I wanted to, I went on and did a lot of research in this area. I felt like survivors of sexual abuse needed their own strategies for healing their sexuality, different from the standard Masters and Johnson sex therapy techniques. Things like sensate focus were just too much, too sexual, and too soon in recovery for them to do. And in my practice as a young therapist and sex therapist, I realized that different types of techniques needed to be developed for survivors. I'm a survivor myself too. And so personally, I knew how challenging it can be to experience sexual assault and abuse, and then to move towards developing new understandings of what sex is and new approaches to sex that are rewarding. So there's a lot of research, a lot of surveys, a lot of interviews, a lot of gleaning information from my counseling practice, which I did for 45 years. If you can, it was a long time I've been doing, I was doing counseling. But what was funny was when this first book, Incest and Sexuality, came out, they kind of made the cover look like a tampon box, you know, and we used to joke about it. When my son at the time was in first or second grade, and his teacher said, "Oh, your mother's an author. Why don't we have her in to talk to the class?" And I thought, really? And then she said to him, "I didn't know she was an entomologist, an insect researcher." So she confused, she thought it was insects like bugs and sexuality instead of incest and sexuality, because at the time, back in the 80s and 90s, people were not talking about sexual abuse and its repercussions, especially those repercussions on intimate relating. So it was filling a void that encouraged me and motivated me to do this. And it's been fascinating, especially developing the relearning touch techniques, which slow things down. We can talk about them more, you know, in this hour, but and help give survivors the developmental skills that they may have missed out on that are important for healthy relating.
Yeah, this is definitely needed. a lot of attention and focus. And I know that in my personal journey, I also been sexually abused as a child for a few years by my stepfather. And I was what I call a sexual mess. I had a sexual desire on the one hand that was, it was curiosity. It was really the desire to feel that connection and that sensation. But that was all in my mind, in my fantasy. But in reality, I was disconnected from my body. I was frozen. I didn't even, I couldn't turn on unless I was activating an abusive fantasy, in which case I was perpetuating that cycle of guilt and shame and disgust. And I could maybe reach an
Yeah.
orgasm, but then I had such a crash down
Yes.
emotionally and yeah, spiritually. So yeah, I'm sure you are familiar with
Oh, that's a common, kind of sequelae to the
mhm,
abuse, to have those kinds of repercussions. It's so confusing. And the
mhm,
problem of unwanted sexual fantasies was also one that was just shrouded in a lot of shame and secrecy. It
mhm,
just hasn't been talked about. I did a lot. It's mentioned in the sexual healing journey. And then I went on to do research. I don't know if you knew this, to do research on women's sexual fantasies and how to heal on unwanted fantasies. I gave workshops on it and ended up doing a book, Private Thoughts, exploring the power of women's sexual fantasies. It has a whole chapter on how to overcome unwanted fantasies.
mhm,
But it makes sense that the mind would go there, because what you learned in terms of what was sex was abuse.
mhm,
That was your earliest associations that you made. And so because abuse is so confusing, and
mhm,
it's especially when it occurs with a family member, you sometimes you get confused as what is love and what's my responsibility, and the perpetrators often tell a lot of lies, like I'm helping to educate you, or you'll like this, or you're so attractive you made me do this. And these kinds of things can make
mhm,
a victim feel that she doesn't feel comfortable about who she is as a sexual person. It's not safe to be inside your own body, conscious in the present moment. So shifting to fantasies is uh, fantasies are one way we can discharge a lot of the emotions that sexual abuse can kind of set aside. It creates a dissociation where we're lost in the fantasy for the period of time it's happening. And I had those issues too, with unwanted fantasies. So I find the area so
mhm,
fascinating.
mhm. Yeah, I would love to hear from you. What is the process that you suggest to move away? I know that for me personally, it was a gradual process. So first, I changed the content of the fantasy. So I kind of found another fantasy that was still not an ideal situation, but it did not include the abuser, because the first one was including the abuser, and that was just too much for me to handle. So then I changed it to somebody that could be potential abuser. It was somebody that was waiting for me outside my school on occasions and offering me all sorts of offers. But in reality, I was no ways. But I invited him into my fantasy because that was just a continuum of that abuse. And then slowly the fantasy mutated or transformed, I'll rather say, to something that was easier for me to digest until eventually I could be able to just drop the fantasy and be present in my body. That was a process of a few years. So I'd love to
That's
hear from you.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, you actually discovered this, a similar thing I discovered, and other people who I talked with had discovered that shifting the contents of the fantasy slowly over time, where you bring it more towards the conditions for healthy sexuality, conditions like consent, conditions like equality, respect, trust, safety, mutuality. And, our sexual fantasies are constantly mutating and changing. We do have some control over doing that. I know one survivor told me that she had a fantasy where it was an older man and a young child, because she was abused as a child. And then over time, she brought the age down in the man. So he went from like a grandpa to a father age to then moving it down towards more an age of somebody she might actually want to date. She was in her 20s, and she brought her age up. So she held on to some of the dynamics that were going on that were erotic to her, like being desired, and some types of touch that she liked to fantasize about. But she took it and changed it into a context that felt so much better. And you were talking about that horrible feeling afterwards. Even if you have an orgasm, you can end up feeling like, yuck, what did I just do? What did I have to think in order to experience that? And you can, but when you heal your fantasies, you then, can have orgasms or just enjoy the arousal without that that negative, bitter aftertaste or whatever to the whole experience. There are other ways you can shift fantasies. You can weave in and out. You can focus yourself on who you are and the age you are now, and sort of go to the fantasy a little, experience some arousal, and then leave it, move into the present moment. So this weaving in and out. Some people stop the fantasy and they just kind of sweep it off to the side because they don't want anything to do with it. And then they just take a moment and relax and breathe in, and then move towards a more physical arousal. Some talk with a partner. If they're with a partner, I'm having this fantasy, and they come up with a creative solution, maybe some different kind of touch, or the partner saying nice things to them during sex, or helping them to stay in the moment. But it's so there are ways you can go in and affect change with unwanted fantasies that are quite powerful and work well. I was surprised doing the workshops. People would come away just feeling like they had just dropped this tremendous weight of shame around their sexuality.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I think this is such a fundamental piece, because in general, in our culture, sexuality is tied to shame in so many ways and forms. And on top of that, if somebody experiences physical some form of abuse, then it's such a big one. And I know that I had shame. I was swimming in shame. And I think that really it's about opening up those conversations as we're doing now. And, when we open our heart and we share, we really realize that first, we're not alone.
Yes.
And right.
That's such a big one.
Me too. Unfortunately, but it's the reality.
Yeah.
And also to share ways to heal, which is really important. And that's the big step. And, I want to share something very personal, because I really think it's a huge piece. And I think that it will inspire the audience that feel resonating with what I'm about to share. But, for me, as I said, I was sexually molested by my stepfather, and he was very gentle and even loving, right? His touch was gentle. Right. He was never violent. He was never doing, in fact, his touch was pleasant. My body responded in a pleasant and receptive ways, way before I knew what sexuality was. I mean, I was 7 years old, so I was just curious. I was just, getting that attention that at that time he was the only adult that was giving me any form of attention. So, so it was so easy to groom me into those kind of games, and then I grew up with it, and in the years it's changed. And when I realized what's going on, obviously a whole lot changed in me. But when I was about 9 years old, I've experienced my first orgasm, and I didn't know what it is. It took me years to connect the dots and think, oh, okay, that's what it was. Because in that moment in time, it's just swept me off my feet, and I was just, whoa. And it was really kind of even changing the trajectory of my life, because it made me be crave and really want those sexual games, because now I've experienced something that really felt so profound in my body. So I wasn't interested in the 9-year-old games outside anymore. I was more circulating this sexual energy that was way too early for me to even contain. And what I felt is that my sexuality, or even my orgasm, was wired with that moment. And for years, I'm talking about a good 20 years after that, my orgasm was wired with that initial experience, in that it's almost like set the tone. And yeah, it was really I intentionally worked into unwiring my orgasmic flow from that initial experience. So I find it really important to share, because so many of us have been enjoying that touch, right? Because we are wired for pleasure. And if it was pleasure, then we might, we could have just responded in a very innocent and curious way, and then we blame ourselves for cooperating, for allowing, for all of that, whereas it's actually not our fault, right? It's the adult responsibility, 100%.
100%. And that the nature of the abuse that you described, where it was gentle and it was, it felt pleasurable, that can be some of the most insidious types of sexual assault. Because I mean, if you're abused by someone who jumps out from some bushes, a stranger, and has a knife, or you definitely know this is sexual violence, it's a violation, but when it's this kind of done it's just, it's just creepy. It's done in the context of love, and how that warps our whole idea of what love is too. And and like you said, the early associations, you were robbed of being able to develop associations with your sensuality and your sexuality and your sexual energy on your own. Like when I was, I'm talking with some of the women who had not been abused about what was the first awakening you had of your sexuality when you had your first orgasm, let's say, and they would describe things like, oh, I jumped into a swimming pool doing the splits, or I slid down a banister, or I was sitting in a cherry tree touching myself. And it's like, whoa, this is so different than, what a sexual abuse survivor experiences, and how nice it would be to have it. We can't choose what happens to us. Things happen, and abuse is a serious problem throughout the world. It happens to large percentages of people. And it often takes till we get older and we realize, hey, all that stuff the guy was saying, that was a bunch of crap, it's not, I was tricked. I think the anger that sexual abuse can stir up can be very healthy in many ways, because it can motivate us to learn about sexual abuse and find out that we're not to blame, wasn't our fault, we didn't deserve what happened to us, our sexuality is separate from what happened to us, and that we're strong and we can heal and we can create. This is one of the things you described, just instinctively knowing you needed to do for yourself, was to create a new sexuality, one that was under your own design and control. And, I think that's, it's really amazing that you knew the importance of doing that at such an early age. Most people, it takes till they're older and often have a lot of negative consequences. From the abuse that they experienced before they hit bottom and change. But sexual abuse is, it's just, it interferes with that healthy development on our own. That is I think all of our birthright. And so sometimes we have to reclaim that ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, the statistics are shocking, right? I mean, I think what it is, 1 out of every 3 women and 1 out of every 5 men have been sexually abused. So this is an epidemic, right?
I think in general too, with being exposed to pornography, violent pornography, not all pornography is going to have a negative effect, but a lot of it can, because so much of it is based on aggression and violence. But so a lot of us have been indirectly sexually abused, even if we didn't have an experience where there was, a direct perpetrator. Just some of the movies and things we've watched, that association of sex as power and control of one person over another, the eroticizing of violence, like that's sexy. It's like, no, that's actually not sexy, that's violence. And but in our culture, that's what's sort of presented to us a lot. And it's easy to get some wiring going, whether you were abused or not, that is similar to what happens to someone who is directly abused. Yeah.
And then, of course, all the messages that we receive from our culture growing up, especially being a woman, and all those conditionings that we receive, that if a woman have many men, then she's a prostitute, and women shouldn't even enjoy sexuality. I mean, I grew up with that underlying belief, and all sorts of beliefs that we inherit from a patriarchal society that was repressed by religion, dogmatization, and it's really
There's a lot of blaming the victim, and perpetrators will do this. The society will do this. They won't believe the victims. They'll blame them for what happened. You were seductive. You had a drink with a guy. You wore a short skirt. Your cleavage was showing. Whatever. They'll put it on when the responsibility is, women should be able to wear whatever they want, whenever they want. And if somebody takes that as an invitation to assault them, that person has a problem. There's so much where the societies around the world are not looking at the very big problem of how many perpetrators exist in our neighborhoods, in our school systems, in our sporting industry, even doctors, and in the churches, and how many perpetrators are around. And one perpetrator often has many victims. And but I think this whole thing of blaming the females and demonizing a female sexuality is a way of maintaining that hierarchy where men have the are being given a sort of a free pass on abusing or being abusive. a lot of the time. And sexual abuse happens to men, males a lot too. So, it goes with both genders or all genders. And, but it's really sad. I did want to say that one other thing we are talking about earlier about orgasm, that a lot of times victims during the abuse will blame themselves for having gotten aroused and having an orgasm. But orgasm, as I describe in the book, that's a way of releasing tension. And it's a logical it's the way our bodies are naturally wired to respond to sensual and sexual erotic touch. So if your body responded like that, well, your body responded like that because that's part of who we are. And it's important for survivors to not become dissociated from their own bodies or develop a kind of hatred for their breasts. Oh, my breasts attracted the perpetrator. He was fascinated with my breasts, or the other genital area too. So we need to also welcome back those very private, special parts of our body and welcome back the responses and the pleasurable feelings as our own and as separate from the abuse.
Yeah, that certainly was my journey. And you mentioned that women often are not believed by society or culture. And I wasn't believed by my own mother. So, the day I told that secret when I was 10 years old, that was the last day I lived in her home.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean,
how old were you? Yeah,
I was
how old
10.
were you?
10.
Boy, and so you decided you were not going to live with her? Is that how, or she said, I don't want you here?
Not exactly like that, but I just could not live with this going on, and it was just too much for me to contain. I felt this constant mess in my head, and I felt that it's too much for me. So I told it to my grandmother, and she was shocked, and she called my mother, and my mother got into a crisis and called me a liar and did not believe me. And my grandmother called my father, which then came with police. So it went through the police, 3 policemen that sat there around the table. And when trauma usually have that tendency of details, right? There's like some kind of imprint in my mind. And I remember sitting there around the lunch table with my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, and these 3 policemen. And they were asking me so many questions that put me in such a shameful space. I think today it would be handled all differently, but back there almost 40 years ago, I was asked, describe us his penis and describe us, and I was just sitting there, trying to cooperate, but being so embarrassed. And my father just took me to his home, and that's how I moved to him. And he was arrested.
Wow.
But there was never penetration. So they couldn't find evidence, and it was my word against his word. And he was very high, in a high position, and of course my mother bailed him out and said that I'm a liar. So
I'm so sorry that happened, but I also want to applaud you at such a young age to recognize that it was an intolerable situation and that you did speak up. And even though it was very upsetting what you went through with the police and having to speak about it and not being believed by your mother, that's an additional abandonment and betrayal of trust from her. That might even be more powerful, a human betrayal, because your mother for so much longer than, and But that you got yourself out of that situation. So bravo, in the long run, I mean, when you think of what the alternative would have been had you had to stay in that, I think it would have probably moved into penetration and other types of sexual behavior. It usually does as the girl gets older. But people need to realize that penetration is not a great way to identify whether it was abuse or not. You can be seriously sexually abused and have lots of consequences, troublesome consequences from it, just from molestation and having that violation to your private parts of your body and feeling those sensations prematurely and out of your own control.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I guess with me, I was really a mess. I mean, when I say a mess, I was a mess, including drugs, including all sorts of things that brought me really, really low quite early in my life. And I was in my early 20s when I experienced what, one can describe the dark night of the soul, where I made a commitment to myself to heal. And I really took it all the way seriously. And I've been healing for many, many years, dedicatedly, and really looking, for teachers. The internet was not as wide and as open. And I think I found, this book, I don't know how long it is, right? But
oh my God, it came out in 1991. But I mean, it's kind of amazing, isn't it, that it's been around for like 30 years and is still considered the main resource for healing the sexual problems caused by abuse. It's gone through some changes, like we said, but I think there's I think I lucked out in many ways, in sense of I must have been able to identify certain basic core principles of what happens to people, and also what people need in terms of healing their sexuality. And but it has endured, and I'm so excited. It came out in the Spanish edition. I think it's over my shoulder. You can see that book on the counter there. But it, because there's so many, I think it's so important to have words of comfort in our own language. And I can't imagine, suffering sexual abuse and only being surrounded by people who spoke a different language than the birth language that I had and the language that I was comforted in. And it also, I think, when you have a good resource, and there are many other ones available now too in the field of sexual abuse, when you have good resources, you can become empowered. And sexual abuse is a way of taking power away from people, and resources give you strength and knowledge and choice to make different choices for yourself. And that creates healing. So things are changing, but I wish I could say that in the 30 years since the Sexual Healing Journey was first released, that there had been more changes. I really had hoped that we were going to expose the problem of sexual abuse internationally. We're going to bring it out of darkness, bring it out of shame and secrecy and silence. And I was so gung-ho and committed to doing that, and training people and lecturing. And we have made substantial changes, that we got to a place where we could have a Me Too movement. But this stuff has been around. Sexual abuse is so ingrained, like racism. It's just, it has this way of sticking to things, and the roots going very deep. And so it's going to take a lot of work to raise consciousness in order to stop it.
Yeah, and it's keep perpetuating, right? Because I really strongly believe that a perpetuator was a victim, him or herself, before.
If you look at a whole group of perpetrators and you ask them, or you're able to find out how many of them were sexually abused, high numbers of, I think it's like in the 80%, 80 to 90% were sexually abused. That doesn't mean that victims and survivors of sexual abuse are going to go on to abuse. I think most people who experience abuse go, I don't ever want to do anything like that to another person. That's awful, So it only works in that one direction of, for certain percentage of people who are abused, it's kind of part of a lifestyle they may have learned intergenerationally in the family, like, oh, this is what men can do and can get away with, or females can do. In some countries, it's the females who abuse the children, or especially young infant boys or things that, and so there's, but those messages that it's like, okay, that the cultures can give are part of the problem. And it can go intergenerationally that way. So speaking out and creating places like rape crisis centers where people can call, hotlines, they have supportive people who can be with them as they share with the police about the abuse. We need a legal system that's more responsive. We also need help for perpetrators where they can get mental health help, sexual offender treatment programs. So it's like a whole response. We can't just go, okay, speak up about your abuse. We have to have all these other things in place in order to, and then also tamping down the influence of any influence in the media or in pornography where there is a connection between sexual violence, sexual exploitation, and arousal. We need to reduce that kind of imagery that can condition people to think it's okay. And, oh, it felt arousing, it was pleasurable, it must have been good. Well, it doesn't work like that. We can be aroused to a lot of things that are abhorrent to us, that we do not want as part of our society. We, sexual things that trigger sexual arousal. There's a wide range of things. I used to call it, when I was studying sexual fantasy, I use the term polymorphous libidinal thought. It was like all different shapes and forms and everything. And, I was so amazed at what, things that could arouse, because often things that increase adrenaline, anger or violence, that can also have an arousal piece to it. So we can get really confused very easily.
But I love how you really gave an holistic overview of moving forward as a culture, right? And really looking at all the aspects, because really our sexuality is our life force energy, right? Sex is only one piece of the puzzle, and sexuality is also how we express ourselves and how we create and how we communicate with the divine. And when there is a sexual abuse, then it really it's affect everything we do. It's really creates such a huge impact on everything and anything. And once we unpack it and come back home to our body to feel safe, to feel pleasure as we designed, humanity will look differently, right?
Right. I'm right there with everything you're saying. That's motivated me in my work so much. And one of the wonderful things of having had a whole career working with sexual abuse survivors is when they've done a lot of healing work, and they end up sharing about all the ways they are expressing themselves more creatively, how much more assertive they are with what their feelings and needs are, how much more confident they are, how much better they're doing in their work environment with being able to advance themselves, get promotions, and take a risk and go for a new career. Or, it when you do, I've always said, when you reclaim your sexuality, you reclaim yourself. And what I mean by that is you reclaim that exact power. Our sexuality is such a core aspect of who we are, how we feel about our bodies, our gender, our ability, our sexual orientation, our ability to connect with another person and receive physical loving and give physical loving to someone else, and experience mutual enjoyment, simultaneous mutual enjoyment. That's so powerful in terms of validation, increasing our self-esteem and our happiness in the world with others. And yeah, so it's such a core aspect. I think it is worth fighting for, to heal.
Exactly. It's so worth it, because it's much more painful to be stuck, right? We are in this body for this whole journey of this lifetime, and if we don't feel good in our own skin, then it's a problem, right? There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere, we try all kinds of methods to disassociate, and I mean, this is our kind of natural survival mechanisms, but that doesn't work for a long time.
Right.
That's that's a calling for healing. And when we decide to go for the healing and go through that rabbit hole, right, it might be
Right.
a journey that takes courage for sure, but it's so well worth it. On the other side, you will reclaim yourself, your power, your joy, your ecstasy, your bliss, your pleasure, your creativity, all of that, right?
Yes, so important.
Yeah, so we have to wrap up this beautiful conversation. And I just want to ask you for a maybe takeaway or some last words that can leave our audience with a little bit more of your wisdom.
I think it's because just to remember that idea that if you were sexually abused, that was a way that someone in the society were taking power away from you, your own power and contentment with yourself and with your body, and that you can now become empowered to take back that sense of being a strong person, and create that sense of being a strong person, and be relaxed and at ease, so that the intimate relating you do benefits you on many levels: mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, and in terms of your place in the whole society. So I guess I wish everybody well with their journey. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for being here. Thank you for what you're doing in the world. Thank you for all that you birthed and had such a huge impact on so many lives. Bless you. Thank you and bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. You too.
Ciao.